Welcome, intrepid historians. Today we're going to look at the saga of the Slavs, from prehistory through the Enlightenment. This painting illustrates a recurring theme of Slavic history, that is, the difficulty that the Slavs encountered, Slavs are the gentleman here on the left, defending their homeland, the flat steppes of Central and Eastern Europe, from invading pastoralist marauders from the east. So, what's a Slav? On the right, you have some contemporary people dressed up as medieval Slavs. Here are some contemporary people dressed up as early modern Slavs. So that's more or less historically what Slavs look like. But to be more precise, we need to look at the prehistoric Indo-Europeans, because Slavs are a branch of Indo-European culture, part of the Indo-European language family. This is the Indo-European heartland as of 4000 BC, and then the diffusion of Indo-European cattle herding culture and their language in the successive millennia. Over time, the proto-Indo-European language splits into several different language families, and we see here in orange where the Slavs wound up in Eastern and Central Europe. So we will be looking at the Slavs, but we'll also be looking at the region of Eastern and Central Europe and how the Slavs interact with other people. All the colors on this map indicate Indo-European languages, so we'll see Slavs interacting with the Balts, with Germans, with Greeks, with Iranic people, but also with non-Indo-European speakers, including some Uralic people and some Turkic people. This is a massive swath of history, from the first appearance of anatomically modern humans in the region, 40,000 BC, until the end of the Enlightenment around 1800. Now I want you to look at this painting and ask yourself, what century do you suppose it shows? This is a 20th century painter, painting an earlier period of Russian history. Painting is from 1908. Painter is actually depicting Russia as it looked earlier in his lifetime, in the 19th century, that is the 1800s. By the 1800s, you had railroads and mechanized agriculture in much of Western Europe and the United States, while in Russia, they're still farming in essentially a medieval style with medieval technology. This is an example of Russian underdevelopment. Here's Russia in the early 1700s. So, that recurring historical question, Western historians, that is European and American historians, tend to ask, what's wrong with Slavs? By which they mean, why aren't Slavs advanced like Americans, like Western Europeans? Now, some of this is mere ethnocentrism, the normal, historically normal human tendency to assume that the culture you happen to be born into is superior and everybody who's different is inferior. But there is more than mere ethnocentrism going on here. It is a fact that Slavic civilization started late and developed slowly, that Slavs generally lagged politically and economically behind Afro-Eurasia's leading powers. Well, why then? Now, we've been working on developing good theses in this class, so I'm going to model by starting this inquiry with a thesis, and here it goes. Isolation often causes underdevelopment. In other words, underdeveloped civilizations are often underdeveloped because they lack contact with more sophisticated civilizations. We're going to see that Slavs actually had the opposite problem. That is, geographically vulnerable in flat Central Eurasia, Slavs endured repeated conquests by harsh rulers that kept Slavs from matching the West's power, prosperity, and freedom. So, there's the thesis. Going to throw down some evidence, see if I can make the case. This map from Chapter 1 of Worlds Together, Worlds Apart shows the spread of agriculture into Europe in the millennia after the Neolithic Revolution kicked off in what is now the Sahara and the Fertile Crescent. You can see that agriculture is spreading into southeastern Europe, into the Balkans, across Western Europe, across the land bridge, courtesy of the Ice Age, into prehistoric England. Agriculture in this span is also breaking out in China in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, but not in Eastern Europe. We can see that the roots of Eastern Europe's underdevelopment run deep. This shading here indicates hunter-gatherer settlements. Now, this isn't happening because it's not good farmland over here. It's excellent farmland. This will be the breadbasket of Europe eventually. But right now, the proto-Slavs who live there are not farming. Despite living on magnificently fertile soil. This map in turquoise is showing you the Eurasian steppes. That is, the flat plains that stretch almost the breadth of the Eurasian supercontinent. Now, it's fertile farmland over here in Eastern Europe, drier and less good to farm over here. What's important about the steppes in Russian history is this will be a highway for invasions. Russia is going to be pummeled like a piñata by repeated invasions across the steppes from the east by pastoralist marauders. Here's a look at Europe in the late Neolithic, in the Copper Age, and the early Bronze Age. We can see farm and mining activity across Western Europe. Still nothing much shaking in Eastern Europe, however. Note that you've got river valley civilizations down there in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and farther east in India and China. Full-blown civilizations, pyramids, ziggurats, palaces. Even in England, you've got Stonehenge being erected. Nothing like that in Eastern Europe. Farming already happening in West Africa, in the Ohio River Valley, in North America. And slowly spreading into Eastern Europe. Proto-Slavic farm villages will appear in the archaeological record by about 1000 BC. Here are some Proto-Slav Bronze Age artifacts, and for comparison purposes, at the same time, roughly Tutankhamun's mask. In South Asia, a complex religious system, Hinduism, appears. The Shang dynasty in China reaches its peak under the Emperor Wu Ding and his wife, General Fu Hao. My man Piye of Nubia is reviving Egyptian civilization, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire is ready to cut a bloody swath through Southwest Asia. Slavs still keeping it real in small farming villages, no civilization yet. By 500 BC, situation has not much changed. They have new neighbors. The Greeks are now ringing the Black Sea with colonies. They've established a major toehold here in the Crimean Peninsula. So the Slavs are nearer civilized people than they've ever been before. Meanwhile, the Axial Age is breaking out all over. The Greeks in the city-states are already perpetrating philosophy. The Axial Age everywhere else is more religious in orientation. Babylonian captivity is over. The Hebrews have now written some of the Bible and continue to write. The prophet Zoroaster has arisen among the Persians, preaching about heaven and hell. The Buddha has introduced religious innovation into Hindu India. Confucius is revolutionizing Chinese philosophy. And the Slavs are keeping it real in pre-civilized farming villages. Now, they've also got neighbors, Scythia. I wonder what that is. Now, here a little bit later, you now have full-fledged Greek city-states around the Black Sea region, including on the Crimean Peninsula. Greek philosophy continues to advance with Plato and Aristotle. Alexander the Great has already conquered his vast empire. It is now broken up into successor states, the Ptolemaic and Seleucid and other empires. The Romans are fighting the First Punic War against Carthage. Ashoka is bringing Buddhism to a vast empire in India. Jinjir Wangdi is 10 years old, but in a few years will create a vast empire in China. And the Slavs are still keeping it real in small farming villages. Note that the Scythians now have a lot of territory, so let's talk about who those Scythians are. This is our first example of pastoralist nomads who wreck the Slavs' world. On the left, you have scalp taking on the right, taking the entire head. The Scythians are Iranic, so Indo-European pastoral nomads, and as pastoralist nomads will do, they find farming villages easy targets, and they frequently raid the proto-Slavs. This reminds us that the plains of Eastern Europe are flat, they are hard to defend. The Eurasian steppes are a highway for invaders. Scythian art is on point, however. They loved gold. You will note clear evidence of Greek influence on their art. Scythians will dominate the plains of Eastern Europe and Central Asia for several centuries. Liking Greek art, it didn't make them sentimental. You will see that they have kicked the Greeks off the north shore of the Black Sea. The Scythians, by the way, are related to the Parthians who we discussed earlier. You remember the Parthians of the famed Parthian shot. Parthians took over the Persians and revitalized the Persian Empire. Parthian Empire, major rival of the Roman Empire for several centuries. And among the Scythians, you get a group called the Sarmatians, a subdivision of the Scythians who inhabit this region where they're ruling over these are nomadic Sarmatians ruling over the local Slav farm villages. You see Balto-Slavs up here. These are the ones living without foreign rulers, but there are still Slavs down here, farm villages, who are answering to Sarmatian masters. Sarmatians like gold too. You will see that their art is less Greek, more stylized. So there is Sarmatians in the Slavic heartland, what's now the country of Ukraine. Bottom left is a Roman depiction of a Sarmatian. Over time, the Slavic farmers, the proto-Slavic farmers, outnumber the Sarmatians and gradually assimilate them culturally. So most of the Sarmatians themselves become sedentary farmers. They blend into the proto-Slavic population. Life is disrupted with the invasion of the Huns. That's right, Attila, not that Attila, and not Attila the hunk either. Yes, that Attila. More nomadic pastoralists from the steppes of Central Asia. But fortunately for the Slavs, the Huns are passing through for the most part. They cut a bloody swath through Eastern Europe, but then they end up landing in the Carpathian Plain in the Balkans, in the north of the Balkans in Eastern Europe. And by the year 500, the proto-Slavs have developed into Slavs, and they begin migrating from the original Slavic heartland of Eastern Europe in all directions. How can they get away with this? Well, several power vacuums have developed. First, to the south and the west, you have the fall of the Western Roman Empire, removing a barrier down here. The Huns have basically folded as an empire. Power vacuum down there. Byzantium going strong for a few centuries, but by the 700s, it's possible to move into former Byzantine lands. And lastly, Charlemagne put together a large Frankish empire here, but after he died, split it among his three sons, and that weakened it, and so that makes movement to the west more possible. Up north, there's no civilization to speak of. Here you have Uralic speakers, and when we refer to them as being uncivilized, what we mean is that, like the Slavs, they lacked all the components that technically comprise a civilization. That is cities, writing, advanced technology, formal government, organized religion, complex division of labor, social hierarchies, social classes. These folks are still tribal. And that concludes part 1.